The fallacy of justice. The city hummed with restless energy as the streetlights flickered against the encroaching darkness. Monica Fields leaned against the counter of her tiny apartment's kitchen, the fluorescent bulb above her head flickering with a faint buzz. She massaged her temples, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical force. 2 jobs, 12 hours of constant motion, and yet the numbers in her bank account refused to add up. Rent, groceries, school supplies for her 2 children. Each one was a beast demanding to be fed. And Monica, a single mother who had learned to survive on grit and resolve, knew she couldn't keep feeding them all forever. The smell of bleach clung to her hands, a lingering reminder of her evening cleaning shift at the medical clinic. Her fingers traced the edge of the list her daughter, Ava, had scribbled in crayon on a scrap of notebook paper. Bread, eggs, milk. Ava had added a smiley face beside chocolate milk, her small way of asking for a treat without really asking. Monica smiled despite the ache in her body. Ava always tried to lighten the load, even if she was only 8. Her son, Tyler, older by 3 years, was already asleep in the next room. Monica envied his ability to drift into dreams, unburdened by the stresses she carried for them both. She glanced at the clock. 10:14 p.m. She still had time to get to the store before it closed. Throwing on her worn blue jacket and grabbing her keys, Monica left her modest apartment with its peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. The air outside was crisp, a reminder that winter wasn't far away. She climbed into her battered Honda, praying it would start without the usual coaxing. It sputtered, but eventually roared to life. As Monica drove, her thoughts wandered to the endless grind of her days. The balancing act between work, parenting, and simply staying afloat was exhausting. Still, she refused to let herself crumble. Her children needed her to be strong, to be their anchor in a world that often felt like it was set against them. Across the city, ambition meets exploitation. Meanwhile, in a gleaming precinct on the other side of town, Officer Jake Warren checked his reflection in the window of his patrol car. Fresh out of the academy, he was still adjusting to the weight of the badge on his chest. But Jake wasn't here to just enforce the law. He was here to prove himself. His superior, Captain Dyer, had made it clear. Quotas weren't just a suggestion. They were a path to advancement. "You've got potential," Dyer had said during Jake's first week. "But potential doesn't mean a damn thing if you can't deliver." The department's got expectations. Arrests keep the streets clean, and the numbers looking good. Don't let me down. Jake had nodded, swallowing the unease that crept up his spine. He'd joined the force to help people, to protect the vulnerable, not to rack up arrests like trophies. But Dyer's words echoed in his mind every time he drove through the so-called high-risk zones, areas where the department claimed crime was rampant. These neighborhoods, always the poorest, always disproportionately black and brown, had become the focal points of what Dyer called proactive policing. In reality, it felt more like persecution. But Jake, young and eager, convinced himself he was doing what needed to be done. Tonight was no different. His patrol car rolled through the quiet streets, his eyes scanning for anything, or anyone, that might meet the loosely defined criteria for suspicion. The encounter. Monica arrived at the corner grocery store, a small, no-frills establishment lit with harsh fluorescent lights. Inside, the aisles were mostly empty save for a few other late-night shoppers and the weary-looking cashier scrolling through his phone. Monica grabbed a cart and began moving efficiently through the aisles, her mental calculator ticking as she compared prices and weight options. She knew this dance well. Find the cheapest brands, avoid anything unnecessary, and stretch every dollar until it snapped. As Monica turned into the canned goods aisle, she caught the attention of Tom Bradley, the store's security guard. Bradley, a middle-aged man with a paunch that strained against his uniform, had been hired by the store's owners primarily to deter theft. He didn't much care for his job, but tonight, he found himself watching Monica more closely than usual. Something about her, maybe her worn coat or the exhaustion on her face, pinged as suspicious in his mind. Bradley wasn't exactly sure why, but he'd seen enough late-night shoppers to trust his gut. He picked up the store's phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yeah, this is Bradley over at Midtown Grocers," he said. "Got a woman here acting suspicious. You might want to send someone to check it out." Jake's radio crackled to life as he finished his third loop through the same neighborhood. "Suspicious activity reported at Midtown Grocers," the dispatcher announced. "Caller reports a possible shoplifting suspect. Unit 27, respond." Jake grabbed the radio, Unit 27, en route. As he pulled into the parking lot, Jake felt a strange combination of excitement and apprehension. This was a chance to prove himself, to show Dyer he was serious about meeting expectations. But as he parked and stepped out of his car, the gravity of what he was about to do lingered in the back of his mind. Inside, Monica approached the checkout counter, meticulously counting out bills from her wallet. Her total came to $42.83, and she paid every cent, tucking the receipt into her jacket pocket like she always did. The cashier barely acknowledged her as he handed over the bags. As Monica pushed open the glass door, the cold night air hit her, but so did Officer Warren. "Excuse me, Mom," Jake called, his voice steady but firm. "I need you to stop for a moment." Monica turned, her brow furrowing. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jake's hand rested on his belt, near his holster. "We've had a report of suspicious activity. I need to check your bags." Monica blinked, the words hitting her like a slap. "Suspicious activity? I just paid for my groceries. I have the receipt right here." "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate," Jake said, his tone sharpening. He felt the weight of Dyer's expectations pressing on him, urging him to take control of the situation. Monica's voice wavered, but she held her ground. "I'm cooperating. You can check the receipt. It's in my pocket." Jake's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Still, the gears of his training turned relentlessly, and within moments, he made a decision he'd come to regret. Shattered dignity, unbroken spirit. The sharp snap of handcuffs echoed in the cold night air as Monica felt the cold metal bite into her wrists. Her heart raced, her breath quickened, but she refused to cry. Crying, she knew, wouldn't help. Not now. Not here. Officer Warren's grip on her arm was firm, but not cruel, yet his eyes betrayed the nervous tension of a rookie eager to follow orders and prove himself. "Officer, I told you," Monica said, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry her conviction. "The receipt is in my pocket. Please, just check." Jake hesitated. For a fleeting moment, he considered her words, but then he glanced over his shoulder and saw Tom Bradley standing at the store's entrance, arms crossed, nodding in approval. The silent encouragement pushed him forward. "Ma'am, I need you to stop resisting," Jake said, his voice growing sharper to mask his uncertainty. "I'm not resisting," Monica said, her tone rising with frustration. "I'm trying to show you." "Let's take this downtown," Jake interrupted, cutting off her protest. The crowd that had begun to gather in the parking lot whispered among themselves, their phones raised to capture the moment. Monica's face burned with shame as she saw the judgment in their eyes. A mother, a thief, another headline waiting to happen. A mother's love meets a system's cruelty. The police cruiser was colder than Monica expected, its interior sterile and unwelcoming. She sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her mind racing through a blur of fears. How would she get home to her children? Would they wake up to find her gone? What if something happened while she was locked away? Her chest tightened at the thought of Ava and Tyler alone in their apartment. Mrs. Harrelson, their elderly neighbor, might check in if she noticed the lights were still on. But what could she do if something went wrong? The cruiser's radio crackled with static and chatter, but Monica barely registered the noise. Her focus was on the receipt still tucked in her pocket, the proof of her innocence, ignored and disregarded. Jake drove in silence, his mind warring with itself. He replayed the events in his head, trying to justify his actions. She matched the description. She resisted. The security guard confirmed it. These thoughts repeated like a mantra, drowning out the small but growing voice of doubt in the back of his mind. They pulled into the station, the building lit by harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to suck the warmth out of the night. Jake parked, opened the back door, and guided Monica out. The other officers milling about barely glanced at her, their indifference sharper than any insult. "Let's get you booked," Jake said, leading her inside. The machine at work. The booking process felt like a violation of everything Monica had ever believed about justice. She had grown up trusting in the system, teaching her children that police were there to protect and serve. But now, standing under harsh lights with her fingerprints pressed into ink and her belongings cataloged into plastic bags, she felt that trust shatter like fragile glass. "Empty your pockets," the booking officer barked, not bothering to look at her. Monica hesitated, turning her cuffed wrists awkwardly. "The receipt is in my pocket," she said again, her voice small but insistent. The officer sighed and fished through her pocket, pulling out the crumpled receipt. He glanced at it briefly before tossing it into a plastic evidence bag without a second thought. Monica's stomach dropped. That was her proof, her shield against the injustice unfolding around her. Yet it was dismissed as if it held no meaning. "Name?" the officer asked, his tone bored. "Monica Fields," she replied, her voice flat. She felt hollow, her identity reduced to words on a form. "Charges?" the officer asked Jake, who stood off to the side. "Suspicious behavior, shoplifting, resisting arrest," Jake replied, the words leaving a sour taste in his mouth. Monica's head shot up. "Resisting arrest? I didn't resist." "Save it for the judge," the booking officer cut her off. "Or your lawyer, if you can afford one." The words stung, a reminder of her precarious financial situation. Monica wasn't sure she could afford much of anything after this ordeal, not her rent, not her groceries, and certainly not a lawyer. The weight of helplessness. Hours crawled by as Monica sat in the cold, cramped holding cell, her arms wrapped around her knees in a futile attempt to ward off the chill. She watched as other women came and went, their faces etched with varying degrees of despair, anger, and exhaustion. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, offering no reprieve from the relentless harshness of her surroundings. Monica's mind refused to rest. She thought of Ava's crayon-written grocery list, of Tyler's quiet strength as he helped her around the house, and of their faces when she didn't come home tonight. Would they be scared? Would they cry? The thought of their tears made her chest ache, but she swallowed the pain. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not ever. The sound of a door opening snapped her out of her thoughts. A female officer approached, her expression unreadable. "Fields," she called, holding a clipboard. "You're being moved." "Moved where?" Monica asked, her voice wary. "Just follow me," the officer said curtly. Monica stood, her legs stiff from sitting so long. As she walked through the station, she caught snippets of conversation among the officers. Words like quota and metrics floated in the air, their meaning dawning on her with a sickening clarity. This wasn't about justice. It was about numbers, numbers that turned people like her into pawns in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Ripples of injustice. Back at the apartment, Ava and Tyler sat huddled together on the couch. Mrs. Harrelson had come over when she noticed the lights still on and the children alone. She did her best to comfort them, but Ava's tears and Tyler's silence spoke volumes. "Your mama's strong," Mrs. Harrelson said, stroking Ava's hair. "She'll be back soon, you'll see." "But why did the police take her?" Ava asked, her voice trembling. "Mama didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Harrelson hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could she explain to an 8-year-old the complexities of systemic injustice? How could she tell them their mother was targeted simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time? The first cracks. In a small office at the precinct, Jake sat staring at his report. The words suspicious behavior and resisting arrest glared back at him like accusations. He thought about the receipt in Monica's pocket, about her calm insistence that she'd done nothing wrong. He thought about her children, likely waiting for her to come home, and the look on her face when the cuffs went on. Was this really what justice looked like? His phone buzzed, a text from Captain Dyer. "Good work tonight, Warren. Numbers are looking good this month." Jake set the phone down, his stomach twisting. Numbers. That's all Monica Fields was to them. A statistic, a checkmark on a spreadsheet. But to her children, she was a mother. To herself, she was someone who'd done everything right, and still ended up here. The doubt that had been a whisper in Jake's mind grew louder, more insistent. Something wasn't right. And for the first time in his short career, Jake began to wonder if he was part of the problem. The spark of defiance. Monica sat in a drab interrogation room under the harsh glare of a single bulb that swung faintly above her. The cold metal of the chair beneath her added to her discomfort, but her spine remained straight. She had no intention of showing weakness. Across from her sat Detective Marlene Connors, an older officer with graying hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and sharp eyes that scanned Monica like a predator sizing up its prey. Connors leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "Let's cut to the chase, Mrs. Fields. We've got you on shoplifting and resisting arrest. Now you can make this easier on yourself by cooperating." "I didn't steal anything," Monica said firmly, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. "I have the receipt. Your officer didn't even bother to check it." Connors smirked, leaning back in her chair. "You expect me to believe this is all just a misunderstanding? That Officer Warren, a decorated rookie with a spotless record, made a mistake." "Yes," Monica said bluntly, "because that's exactly what happened." The detective's smirk faltered. She opened a manila folder and pulled out a printed photograph of Monica's mugshot. "You're no stranger to the police, are you, Mrs. Fields? There's a record here. Domestic disturbances, trespassing complaints." Monica's jaw clenched. "Those weren't crimes. I called the police to report my ex-husband's abuse. And the trespassing? That was a landlord trying to evict me illegally." Connor's expression soured as she shuffled the papers back into the folder. "Regardless, your history doesn't paint a pretty picture. Now, we're offering you a deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor theft, and you'll get time served. No jail time. A small fine. It's a good offer." Monica leaned forward, her voice rising slightly. "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do." Connor sighed, closing the folder. "You might want to think about your kids, Mrs. Fields. A guilty plea gets you home sooner. If this goes to trial, who knows how long it'll take." Her kids. The mention of Ava and Tyler was like a knife twisting in Monica's gut, but she refused to let the pain show. "I am thinking about my kids," she said through gritted teeth. "That's why I'm not admitting to something I didn't do. I won't teach them to accept injustice." Connor's eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Suit yourself." A community stirs. While Monica sat alone in her holding cell, her story began to ripple through the community. A bystander's video of the arrest had already been uploaded to social media, gaining traction with each passing hour. The grainy footage showed Monica being handcuffed while pleading with Officer Warren to check her receipt. In the background, her groceries lay scattered on the pavement, and the cries of her children echoed in the parking lot. The video found its way to Rachel Martinez, a fiery community activist known for taking on cases of police misconduct. Rachel had seen too many stories like Monica's, a single mother of color wrongfully targeted by a system designed to exploit the vulnerable. She immediately shared the video with her followers, adding her own call to action. "Another mother torn from her children," Rachel wrote. "Another family traumatized by a corrupt system that prioritizes quotas over justice. We need to stand with Monica Fields. Protest tomorrow at 10 a.m. outside the precinct. Bring your signs, your voices, and your determination." By morning, The hashtag Justice for Monica was trending locally, with dozens of people sharing their own experiences of being unfairly targeted by the police. Stories poured in. A teenager arrested for loitering outside his own apartment complex, a grandmother accused of shoplifting after forgetting to scan a single item at the self-checkout, a father detained for looking suspicious while waiting for his son outside a school. Monica's story had struck a nerve. The rookie's doubts. Jake Warren sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of him. He was supposed to be writing his report on Monica's arrest, but the words refused to come. Instead, his mind replayed the scene over and over. Monica's calm insistence that she had a receipt, her children's terrified cries, the bags of groceries spilling onto the asphalt. He glanced at his phone, where a text from Captain Dyer awaited. "Nice work last night. Keep it up." Jake's stomach churned. Was it nice work? Was arresting a struggling mother over a supposed theft really what he had signed up for? He had joined the force with dreams of making a difference, of protecting people, of standing for what was right. But now he wasn't so sure. His thoughts were interrupted by Officer Maria Rivera, a senior officer known for her no-nonsense demeanor and reputation for pushing back against unfair practices. She leaned against the edge of his desk, her arms crossed. "You look like someone stole your dog," she said. Jake forced a weak smile. "Just thinking about the arrest last night?" she asked, her voice softening slightly. Jake hesitated but nodded. It didn't feel right. She kept saying she had a receipt. What if she was telling the truth? Rivera sighed. What if she was? Are you ready to deal with what that means? Jake frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Rivera said, lowering her voice, that if you dig into this, you might not like what you find. Quotas, profiling, targeting poor neighborhoods. It's all there if you're willing to look. But looking means you can't pretend you didn't see it. Her words hung in the air as Jake stared at his desk. He wasn't sure he was ready to look, but he wasn't sure he could avoid it either. A new ally. Monica was released later that day, her bail paid by Mrs. Harrelson, who had dipped into her meager savings to help. As Monica walked out of the precinct, blinking against the harsh sunlight, she was met with an unexpected sight. A small crowd of protesters holding signs and chanting her name. "Justice for Monica," they shouted. "Stop the quotas. End police injustice." Rachel Martinez pushed through the crowd to reach Monica. "Mrs. Fields," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Rachel Martinez. I saw the video of your arrest. We're here to help." Monica hesitated, overwhelmed by the attention. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll fight," Rachel said, her voice firm but encouraging. "This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been targeted by this system. You're not alone." For the first time since her arrest, Monica felt a flicker of hope. She nodded. "I'll fight." The first steps toward justice. That evening, Monica met with Jason Bell, a civil rights attorney Rachel had recommended. Jason was young but sharp, with an intensity that suggested he wasn't afraid of a fight. "Your case is bigger than a wrongful arrest," Jason explained as they sat in his cluttered office. "This precinct has a history of targeting people like you, single mothers, low-income workers, people of color. They operate on quotas, and your arrest fits the pattern perfectly." Monica frowned. "Quotas? You mean they have a set number of people they want to arrest?" Jason nodded. "Exactly. It's illegal, but they disguise it as proactive policing. The more arrests they make, the more funding they get from the city. And the people they arrest. Most can't afford to fight back, so they plead guilty to avoid jail time. It's a cycle that ruins lives." Monica clenched her fists. "So, what do we do?" "We build a case," Jason said. "We find witnesses, gather evidence, and shine a light on their practices. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but we can fight this. Are you in?" Monica thought of Ava and Tyler, of their tear-streaked faces the night she was taken away. She thought of all the other mothers who might be next if she didn't stand up. "I'm in," she said. Cracks in the wall. The sunlight streaming through Monica's apartment window did little to dispel the storm brewing in her chest. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped tightly around a mug of lukewarm tea. Across from her sat Jason Bell, a stack of papers and a battered laptop open in front of him. His tie was askew, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing a man deep in the trenches of a fight. Jason leaned forward, his tone urgent but measured. "Monica, this case is bigger than any of us. It's not just about clearing your name. It's about dismantling a system that's been targeting people like you for years." Monica glanced at the crumpled receipt Jason had placed between them on the table. "I get that," she said softly. "But my kids, they're already being treated like outcasts at school. Tyler came home with a split lip yesterday because some kid called me a thief. Ava won't even go outside anymore. How do I protect them and fight this?" Jason's expression softened, but his resolve remained firm. "You protect them by standing up. By showing them that the truth matters, even when it's hard. I won't lie. This fight is going to be tough. But you're not alone. I'm with you. Rachel's with you. The community is rallying behind you." Monica sighed, rubbing her temples. The weight of it all felt crushing, but Jason's words lit a small spark of hope. "What's the next step?" she asked. Jason pushed the stack of papers toward her. "We start here. We need to file a motion for the police department's records. Arrest logs, internal communications, anything that proves they're running on quotas. It'll be a fight to get them, but we need that evidence." Monica nodded, her resolve solidifying. "Let's do it." The precinct's fragile facade. Across town, Captain Dyer stood in his office, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out the window. The murmurs of discontent from the community had grown louder in recent days, and the video of Monica's arrest had sparked a firestorm he hadn't anticipated. Officer Jake Warren sat uncomfortably in the chair across from him, his hands resting nervously on his knees. He had been summoned to the captain's office with little explanation, but the tension in the air told him it wasn't good. Dyer turned, his expression cold. "Warren, I've been hearing things." Jake swallowed hard. "Sir." "Whispers," Dyer said, leaning against his desk. "That you've been questioning how we operate, that you're starting to feel conflicted." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. I've been thinking about the arrest, sir. The woman, Monica Fields, she had a receipt. What if we made a mistake?" Dyer's eyes narrowed. "Mistake? Do you know how many arrests we've made in that zone this year alone? How many convictions we've secured? Our numbers are solid. Warren, that's what matters. The system works because we make it work. But what if the system is broken?" Jake blurted out, the words tumbling from his mouth before he could stop them. "What if we're hurting people who don't deserve it?" Dyer's face hardened, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You're a rookie, Warren. You don't know how this game is played yet. Let me make one thing clear. Questioning the system is a fast track to unemployment. Keep your head down, do your job, and leave the rest to me." Jake left the office with his stomach in knots. For the first time, he truly saw the system for what it was, a machine that didn't care about justice, only results. The fight for records. Jason's motion for the precinct's records was met with immediate resistance. The department's lawyers filed objections, citing confidentiality and ongoing investigations. Judge Nathan Carter, known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, presided over the hearing. His sharp eyes scanned the room as the arguments unfolded. The police department's lawyer, a grizzled man named Alan Pierce, stood with an air of smug confidence. "Your Honor, releasing these records would jeopardize the integrity of our operations and the safety of our officers." Jason rose from his seat, his voice steady but impassioned. "Your Honor, this isn't about officer safety. It's about accountability. The evidence suggests a systemic abuse of power. Arrest quotas targeting minority communities, coercion, and false charges. These records are crucial to proving that." Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. Mr. Pierce, is there any legitimate reason why these records shouldn't be made available, aside from your desire to avoid scrutiny? Pierce sputtered, his confidence faltering. Your Honor, these are internal matters. Enough, Carter interrupted. I'm granting the motion. The records will be turned over within 7 days. Jason's heart soared, but he knew the fight was far from over. A community mobilizes. The release of the records sparked a frenzy. Rachel Martinez organized a town hall meeting, drawing in dozens of community members eager to share their stories. Monica sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as one person after another took the microphone. An elderly man recounted being arrested for loitering outside his own home. A young woman described being pulled over and handcuffed for a broken taillight. A teenager spoke tearfully about spending a night in jail for suspicious behavior while walking home from basketball practice. The patterns were undeniable, and Monica felt both anger and determination swelling within her. She stood when Rachel called her name, walking to the microphone with her heart pounding. My name is Monica Fields, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. I was arrested for stealing groceries I paid for. My children saw me handcuffed and taken away like a criminal, and I'm here to say I won't let this happen to anyone else. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Monica felt the strength of the community behind her. The system fights back. As Monica's case gained traction, the precinct's leadership scrambled to contain the fallout. Captain Dyer ordered his officers to stay silent, warning them that any leaks would be met with severe consequences. But cracks were beginning to form in the ranks. Officer Maria Rivera, a veteran with a reputation for integrity, began compiling her own evidence. She had seen too much during her years on the force: arrest quotas, manipulated reports, and the quiet punishment of officers who refused to play along. One evening, Rivera approached Jake in the locker room. "Warren," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I need to know. Are you ready to do the right thing?" Jake hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "What do you mean?" "I mean testifying," Rivera said firmly. "We both know what's going on here. If you're willing to speak up, we can bring this whole system down." Jake looked at her, fear and determination warring within him. "What happens if we lose?" Rivera's gaze hardened. "Then at least we can say we tried." The tipping point. Monica's legal team, bolstered by the community's support, began piecing together a damning case. The records revealed a pattern of arrests concentrated in poor, minority neighborhoods. Officers who met quotas received bonuses and promotions, while those who didn't were ostracized. Rachel's activist network amplified the findings, organizing protests and flooding social media with stories of injustice. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the entire city was paying attention. Monica sat in her living room one evening, surrounded by Ava and Tyler, as a news anchor recounted her story on live television. The kids were quiet, their eyes fixed on the screen. "Mama," Ava whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Monica wrapped her arms around her children, her resolve unwavering. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay, because we're fighting for what's right." Across town, Captain Dyer watched the same broadcast, his jaw tightening as the walls of his empire began to crumble. The truth emerges. Monica sat in the courthouse lobby, her hands gripping a folder filled with documents that represented her innocence and the growing case against the system that had tried to break her. Around her, the buzz of anticipation filled the air. Supporters shuffled in, reporters adjusted their equipment, and her attorney, Jason Bell, paced back and forth, rehearsing arguments under his breath. Monica's children sat beside her. Ava clutched her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. Tyler, older and more stoic, sat stiffly, his gaze darting around the room like a soldier scanning for threats. Monica leaned down and kissed the top of Ava's head. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered. Ava looked up at her, her eyes wide and serious. "Promise." Monica smiled softly, though her heart ached. I promise." Jason stopped pacing and crouched down in front of them. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Monica nodded. "I've been ready since the night they put those handcuffs on me." Jason smiled, standing up and straightening his tie. "Let's go show them what justice looks like." The courtroom drama. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with a mix of supporters, activists, reporters, and silent onlookers curious to see the scandal unfold. Judge Nathan Carter presided, his reputation for fairness and disdain for corruption making him the perfect figure for this pivotal moment. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Maria Rivera. She walked with the confidence of someone who had made peace with the risks of telling the truth. Jason approached her carefully, setting the tone for what would become a series of explosive testimonies. "Officer Rivera," Jason began, "how long have you been with the department?" 17 years, she said. "And in that time, have you observed any practices within the precinct that you believe to be unlawful or unethical?" Rivera hesitated, glancing briefly at Captain Dyer, who sat stone-faced behind the prosecution's table. Then she nodded. "Yes." The courtroom stirred, a ripple of whispers spreading through the gallery. "Can you elaborate on these practices?" Jason pressed. Rivera took a deep breath. "For years, the department has operated on an unofficial quota system. Officers were pressured to make arrests, regardless of the severity of the crime, or even if a crime had occurred. Those who met the quotas received bonuses or favorable assignments. Those who didn't were punished." Jason nodded, his tone growing sharper. "Punished how?" "Denied overtime, given the worst shifts, or reassigned to dangerous areas," Rivera said. "Some were even investigated for fabricated complaints." "And what about Captain Dyer? Was he aware of this quota system?" Rivera's gaze locked on Dyer. "He didn't just know about it. He enforced it. He created it." The courtroom exploded in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Rivera's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The rookie's reckoning. Jake Warren sat outside the courtroom, his foot tapping nervously against the polished tile floor. He knew his turn on the stand was coming, and the weight of what he was about to do pressed on him like a physical force. Rivera's testimony had rattled him. She had spoken with conviction, her words cutting through the lies and half-truths he'd been telling himself since his first day on the force. And now it was his turn to choose. Protect the system or expose it. Jason appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's time." Jake stood, smoothing his uniform. He'd come in full dress blues, a decision that felt both symbolic and necessary. He wasn't just a witness. He was a representation of the system itself, for better or worse. On the stand, Jason wasted no time. "Officer Warren, can you describe the events of the night you arrested Monica Fields?" Jake cleared his throat. "I received a call from the grocery store security guard reporting suspicious activity. When I arrived, I observed Mrs. Fields leaving the store with grocery bags." "And what did you do?" "I approached her and asked her to stop. She told me she had a receipt and offered to show it to me." Jason's voice grew sharper. "And did you check the receipt?" Jake hesitated, shame creeping into his voice. "No." "Why not?" "Because," Jake's voice cracked, and he took a deep breath. "Because I was under pressure to meet quotas. I didn't see a mother trying to feed her kids. I saw an easy arrest." The gallery erupted again, and the judge's gavel slammed down. Jason stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Officer Warren, are you saying you arrested Monica Fields because of a quota?" Jake nodded. "Yes." "Do you believe Mrs. Fields committed a crime?" "No," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't." The evidence piles up. As the trial continued, Jason presented damning evidence. Internal memos detailing the quota system, financial records showing bonuses tied to arrest numbers, and testimony from other officers who had been coerced or punished under Dyer's regime. One particularly devastating piece of evidence came from David Wilson, the grocery store manager. He had saved a backup of the surveillance footage, showing Monica paying for her groceries, footage that the precinct had pressured him to delete. I was told that cooperating with the police would be in my best interest, Wilson testified. They made it clear that if I didn't comply, my business would suffer. Jason held up the footage for the courtroom to see, the grainy video playing on a large screen. Monica could be seen carefully counting her money, handing it to the cashier, and tucking the receipt into her pocket. The jury watched in silence as the truth unfolded before them. Captain Dyer's collapse. By the time Captain Dyer was called to the stand, his confidence had visibly eroded. The once commanding figure now looked like a man drowning in his own lies. Jason approached him with a mix of respect and calculated aggression. Captain Dyer, were you aware of the quota system in your precinct? Dyer hesitated, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. I wouldn't call it a quota system, he said finally. We had metrics to ensure accountability. Metrics? Jason repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. And were these metrics tied to financial incentives for officers? That's not how I would describe it, Dyer said, shifting uncomfortably. Jason leaned in, holding up a copy of one of Dyer's emails. How would you describe this, then? An email instructing officers to focus on high-yield areas and maximize arrests in the days leading up to a budget review. Dyer's face turned red, but he didn't respond. A mother's testimony. Finally, Monica took the stand. She recounted the night of her arrest, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She described the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of her children, the terror in Ava's cries, the hopelessness she'd felt in the holding cell. I'm not just fighting for myself, she said, her voice rising. I'm fighting for every mother, every father, every child who's been targeted by this broken system. I refuse to let this happen to anyone else. As she spoke, the gallery sat in stunned silence. Even the reporters stopped taking notes, captivated by her words. The verdict approaches. The trial stretched into its third week, the weight of the evidence impossible to ignore. The jury deliberated for hours, their faces grim as they filed back into the courtroom. Have you reached a verdict? Judge Carter asked. The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. Monica held her breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the defense table. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. In the case of Monica Fields versus the city of Arcadia, the foreperson said, we find the defendant not guilty. The gallery erupted in cheers, and Monica's knees buckled as relief flooded her body. Jason caught her, his smile wide and triumphant. A reckoning begins. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the verdict was read aloud. Supporters in the gallery cheered, tears streaming down their faces, while Monica sat in stunned silence, the words "not guilty" echoing in her mind. Her grip on the defense table loosened, and she felt the tension drain from her body. Jason Bell leaned down, his voice soft but triumphant. You did it, Monica. You stood your ground and won. Monica turned to her children, who sat with Mrs. Harrelson in the front row. Ava's eyes were wide with disbelief, and Tyler's stoic mask cracked as a smile broke through. They rushed toward her, throwing their arms around her as the gallery erupted in chants. Justice for Monica. Rachel Martinez, standing in the back, held up a megaphone and rallied the crowd outside the courthouse, where protesters had been waiting for the verdict. This isn't just a victory for Monica Fields, Rachel declared, her voice booming. This is a victory for every person who has been silenced, targeted, and oppressed by this corrupt system. Outside, the chants grew louder, spreading across the city as news outlets broadcast the historic verdict. For Monica, it felt like a moment of vindication, not just for herself, but for every injustice she had endured and fought against. A captain falls. While Monica celebrated her victory, Captain Dyer sat in his office at the precinct, the walls closing in around him. His carefully constructed empire of quotas and intimidation was crumbling, and the once loyal officers he had groomed were turning against him. The precinct had become a hornet's nest of whispers, side glances, and quiet rebellion. A sharp knock on his door broke his thoughts. Alan Pierce, the precinct's lawyer, entered, his expression grim. "It's over, Dyer," Pierce said, throwing a stack of papers onto the desk. "The city's launching a full investigation into your practices. Internal Affairs is involved, and the FBI is circling. You've got one option: resign." Dyer's jaw clenched, his pride refusing to yield. "I built this precinct," he snapped. "I kept the streets clean. I won't be painted as a villain for doing my job." Pierce crossed his arms. "Your job destroyed lives. The evidence against you is overwhelming. If you don't resign, they'll make an example of you." Hours later, news broke that Captain Dyer had stepped down, his resignation letter laced with bitterness and defiance. But the damage was done. His legacy was tarnished, and his empire dismantled. The precinct in turmoil. Officer Jake Warren sat quietly in the precinct break room, his badge and gun resting on the table in front of him. Rivera entered, her expression tired but relieved. "You did good," she said, sitting across from him. Jake shook his head. "I should have spoken up sooner. I arrested her, Rivera. I put her through hell." "And you took responsibility," Rivera said firmly. "That's more than most would have done. You've got a choice now: stay and fight for change, or walk away." Jake looked at his badge, the symbol of a system he had once believed in. "I don't know if I deserve to wear this anymore." Rivera reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what you do next." A community transformed. Monica's case sparked a wave of activism that swept through the city. Rachel's network grew exponentially as more victims of the quota system came forward, their stories adding fuel to the fire of change. Town halls were organized, protests grew larger, and demands for accountability became impossible to ignore. Judge Nathan Carter, emboldened by the case's outcome, ordered a citywide audit of police practices. The results were damning. A systematic pattern of racial profiling, coerced plea deals, and falsified reports designed to inflate arrest statistics. The findings led to the dismissal of several high-ranking officials and the implementation of new oversight measures. The City Council, under immense pressure, introduced sweeping reforms. Quotas were officially banned, and an independent civilian review board was established to oversee complaints against law enforcement. Officers like Rivera were promoted, while those complicit in the corruption faced disciplinary action, or worse. Monica's new chapter. Months after the trial, Monica stood in front of a packed auditorium, her hands gripping a podium. She had been invited to speak at a citywide forum on police reform, her story now a rallying cry for justice. "I'm not a lawyer or a politician," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm just a mother who wanted to feed her kids. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, but it did. And for years, it's been happening to others. This fight isn't just about me. It's about building a system that protects everyone, not just the privileged." The audience erupted in applause, and Monica felt a swell of pride. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to stop using it. The personal costs. Despite the victory, the scars of her ordeal lingered. Ava and Tyler still carried the emotional weight of seeing their mother arrested, and Monica worked tirelessly to rebuild their sense of security. She had found a new job through connections made during the trial, but the shadow of her arrest followed her. One evening, as she tucked Ava into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mama, are the bad police gone now?" Monica's heart ached. "Some of them are, baby, but we're still working to make sure the good ones stay, and the bad ones don't come back." Tyler, listening from his bed, spoke up. "Do you think Officer Warren was bad?" Monica paused, considering her words. "I think he made a mistake, but he tried to make it right. That's what matters." Ripples of change. The impact of Monica's case extended far beyond the city. National news outlets picked up her story, sparking debates about policing practices across the country. Communities inspired by her fight began demanding similar reforms in their own precincts. Rachel Martinez's activist network grew into a city-wide coalition, advocating for education, housing, and healthcare reforms alongside policing changes. Monica became a prominent voice in the movement, balancing her new role as an advocate with her responsibilities as a mother. A glimmer of hope. On a quiet evening, Monica stood on her apartment balcony, looking out over the city. The skyline shimmered in the distance, a reminder of the community she had fought to protect. Ava and Tyler played inside, their laughter a balm to her weary soul. Jason Bell had called earlier that day with good news. The city council had approved a settlement for the wrongful arrests tied to the quota system. Monica's portion would be enough to secure a better home for her family and set up a small college fund for her children. But the money wasn't what mattered most. It was the knowledge that she had made a difference, that her fight had brought about real change. As the wind rustled her hair, Monica closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. And hope, she knew, was the most powerful weapon of all. Justice rekindled. The months that followed Monica's acquittal were a whirlwind of both victories and challenges. Each step forward seemed to come with a reminder of how deeply the system's flaws had scared her life and the lives of so many others. Yet Monica was determined to ensure that the fire she had sparked wouldn't burn out. Healing the wounds. Back at her modest apartment, Monica was piecing together her new life. The settlement money Jason had mentioned came through, but instead of spending it all at once, Monica made careful decisions. She moved her family to a slightly larger apartment in a safer neighborhood, one with a reliable school for Ava and Tyler. Ava, however, struggled to move past the trauma of her mother's arrest. Nightmares would wake her, tears streaming down her small face as she clung to Monica. "Why did they take you, Mama?" Ava asked one night, her voice trembling. "You didn't do anything wrong." Monica knelt beside her daughter's bed, stroking her hair. "Sometimes, baby, people make bad choices because they're scared or because they don't care to see the truth. But we stood up to them, didn't we? And now things are changing. It's going to be better, for us, and for so many others." "But what if it happens again?" Ava whispered. Monica hugged her tightly. "I'll always fight for you, Ava. Always. No one will ever take me from you again." Tyler, standing in the doorway, nodded solemnly. Though he rarely expressed his emotions, Monica could see the weight he carried. He had taken on the role of the protector during her absence, and she vowed to help him find his way back to being a carefree child. The final collapse of Captain Dyer. The investigations into Captain Dyer's practices intensified, leading to explosive revelations. Internal memos, emails, and financial records painted a damning picture of a man who had built his career on exploitation. He had pressured officers to inflate arrest numbers, manipulated data to secure funding, and silenced dissenters through threats and fabricated complaints. The FBI announced formal charges against Dyer for civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and fraud. As he stood in front of the cameras during his arrest, his once commanding presence had crumbled into a shadow of the man who had ruled his precinct with fear. "This isn't over," he growled to reporters, but his words carried no weight. The tide had turned, and no one was coming to save him. Monica watched the news with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She knew that while Dyer's downfall was a victory, it was only one piece of the larger puzzle. The fight to dismantle systemic injustice wouldn't end with one man's arrest. Monica's growing influence. Jason Bell's work on Monica's case catapulted him into the spotlight as a fierce advocate for civil rights. He opened a nonprofit legal clinic to assist others who couldn't afford legal representation. Monica became his partner in the mission, speaking at events and sharing her story to inspire others. At one such event, she stood in front of a crowd of young law students. "I'm not a lawyer," she said, her voice carrying through the lecture hall. "I don't have a degree. But I know what it feels like to be powerless, to have your dignity stripped away because someone decided you didn't matter. And I also know what it feels like to fight back. Use your knowledge, your privilege, to help people like me, people who don't have a voice." The room erupted in applause, and Monica felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. Jake Warren's redemption. Meanwhile, Officer Jake Warren faced his own reckoning. After his testimony, he had been suspended without pay and subjected to an internal review. But instead of disappearing into obscurity, Jake chose to confront his role in the system head-on. He began volunteering at community centers in the neighborhoods he had once patrolled, listening to the stories of the people he had wronged. Slowly, he earned their trust, not through words but through action. He worked to rebuild the bridge he had helped burn, one conversation at a time. One day, he met Monica at a community event. Nervously, he approached her, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Mrs. Fields," he said, his voice unsure. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Monica studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Officer Warren. I can see you're trying to make things right. Keep doing that. The community needs people who are willing to change." Jake walked away feeling lighter, as though her forgiveness had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. A family reunited. One quiet evening, Monica sat with her children on the balcony of their new apartment. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, a reminder of how far they had come. Eva leaned against her mother, her head on Monica's shoulder, while Tyler sat cross-legged, a book in his lap. "Mama," Eva said softly, "you're like a superhero." Monica chuckled, brushing her daughter's hair away from her face. "A superhero? Ha! I don't have a cape or superpowers." "You don't need those," Tyler said, looking up from his book. "You stood up for yourself. And for us. That's more powerful than anything." Monica's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, my loves. You're the reason I fought so hard. Everything I do for you." The beginning of change. Months turned into a year, and the city continued to evolve. New leadership in the police department brought reforms designed to rebuild trust with the community. Officers like Rivera were promoted to positions of influence, ensuring that voices of integrity shaped the future. Rachel Martinez's activist network expanded statewide, using Monica's story as a rallying cry for justice. Other cities began examining their own policing practices, and a national conversation about quotas and systemic bias gained momentum. Monica remained at the forefront of the movement, balancing her advocacy work with her role as a mother. Her days were long and often exhausting, but the spark of hope she had kindled in the courthouse had grown into a flame that burned brightly in her heart. Epilogue. Justice's legacy. On the anniversary of her acquittal, Monica returned to the courthouse steps, this time with Ava and Tyler by her side. A small plaque had been placed there, bearing the words, "In honor of those who stand against injustice and fight for truth." Ava traced the words with her fingers, looking up at her mother. "This is for you, isn't it?" "It's for all of us," Monica said, her voice steady. "For everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. We all matter." Tyler took her hand, his grip firm. "What's next, Mama?" Monica smiled, looking out at the city that had tried to break her, but instead made her stronger. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." And as the sun set over the courthouse, Monica knew that her fight wasn't just for her family. It was for every family, for every person who had been silenced, and for a future where justice was more than a word. It was a promise.